Hey guys, I'm going to show you how to use the one-shot sample feature in Ultimate Heavy Drums. If you don't know what a one-shot sample is, it's just one singular hit, either like a kick, snare or a tom, usually just like a WAV file, just the one sound. Whereas all the snares, for example, in the Kontakt instrument or the Slate Trigger TCI files are multi-velocity. So for a snare, there's usually like 7 different velocities, starting at a really light ghost note all the way up to a really loud rim shot. And at every different velocity layer, there's usually like 7 different hits. So you're never going to hear the same sound in a row. But with a one shot, you're going to hear the exact same sound every time. Now, these have been used for effect in mixing for years and years. Black Album's probably full of it. Tons of the old like Morrisound death metal stuff, they were using samples back in the day. Even mixes like Paramore Riot, I mean that's nearly a metal drum mix by David Bendith. I heard there's about like 12 different snare samples all layered on top of each other. And the purpose of using a one-shot sample, specifically when you're in the world of real drums and mixing real drums, is they'll just add that level of consistency between hits, because it is just that one sound and you tuck it under your real drums just to help really solidify things, especially with kicks and snares. Tons of metal records throughout the last like 20, 30 years, the kick ends up being like fully replaced with a one-shot sample. And only more recently, if people are triggering or sample replacing their kick drums, you can do it now with Slate Trigger TCI files where you're going to hear a different kick sound each time. Back in the day, there was a program called Drumagog, which I'm sure is still around, but I don't think no one I know uses that anymore. So there are ways of sampling drums and making them sound realistic, completely resampling them. But when you use a one-shot sample, you're going to have that sort of machine-like sound to it, especially on like a fast snare on, because it's just that one hit. But it's a very cool feature to have. It's really great in the Kontakt instrument to be able to blend in some of the samples that I provided, but you can blend in any samples of your choice if you have any. You can create your own samples. You can even steal samples off records you like if there's an isolated kick or snare. I've done that many times. And you can load those into the Kontakt instrument as well. And I'll show you a few different ways that I go about using the one-shot sample feature. So I've got this demo loaded up with Ultimate Heavy Drums. This is how it's sounding. And that is just the default kit where I changed the kick and the snare. So the kick is the Yamaha 24-inch Evans head, which is what the E pertains to. And the snare is the Gretsch Bell Brass lower tuning. And if I mess with the pitch, yeah, snare pitch has come down just -1. So that's how it's sounding. So I'm going to show you how to load in the one-shot sample. So first we go up to the Files section here, top left in Kontakt, click on Files, then you're going to locate the folder. So with your order of Ultimate Heavy Drums, you'll receive a separate download which will have Middleton, TCI and one-shot files, and in that will be the one-shots folder, and we're going to go to the kick one-shots, start with the kick. And just to add on, if you're using the free Kontakt player and you don't see where to load in the one-shot samples and where the file section is, usually as default it just looks like this. So you go to this section here, click on the side panel, and you'll see your libraries, and you just want to go into this files tab here, and you'll be able to locate the files on your computer that way. So the kick that I have loaded up in Kontakt, as I said, is the Yamaha 24 E head kick. So let's pick a different sample to blend in with that one. So all of these hits here, the one shots provided, are samples from the library, but I've just picked one hit for each of them. So I like this Q kick here, and how I get it into the loader is clicking on it and dragging it into the sample section there. And now it's going to be loading up and triggering on this one-shot fader here on that channel, which is going to be triggered from the same MIDI note, so you don't need to worry about that. So I'm going to bring that level in from 0. And what we've got here is the phase button in Ultimate Heavy Drums, and it sounded a bit thin when I brought it up, so flipping the phase made it sound more in phase to me. And this is me removing the Kontakt kick and just relying on the one-shot sample. All of the other features within the Kontakt instrument you can still do to the one-shot sample, so you can use the tilt EQ. You can do the transient designer, you can add a bit more sustain or attack to the kick one shot. And obviously you can add, you can change the pitch. And obviously it's got its own reverb as well. So what I would typically do with one-shot samples, I'd listen to Kontakt in solo. Don't want to hear any guitars over it, and just listen to the kick from Kontakt in solo on its own. And then listen to this one in solo. And what I try and do with kicks and snares is try and listen into the pitch of the drum. It's kind of harder to detect pitch on kick drums as opposed to snares, which usually have a kind of a note ringing to them. And try and match the pitch, and that way usually the phase sits a bit better between them. So I'm going to listen to that one again. Now on my headphones at least, that sounds closer in pitch. Obviously when you're in a room with big speakers and you're hearing the sub, sometimes the low end can get a bit confusing. So I'm just going to hear how that sounds and try and get them in phase. Let's see how they sound blending that one in. So it still sounds better with that phase switch inverted. You can either do that on the quote-unquote real kick in Kontakt or on the one-shot sample. So a cool trick you can do that I think works particularly well with kick drums to create like a new and unique sound is using all of the high end from one drum and all of the low end from the other. So the trick that I'm going to show you next, typically you hear more variety in the high end of a kick drum, and obviously as I said, even at the hardest velocity there's about 7 different hits here, so you're never going to hear the same hit in succession. So let's view this kick here from the Kontakt instrument as the quote-unquote real kick sound that's going to have a bit more variation between hits, and use all of the high end from that one, and then we're going to use all of the low end from the one-shot sample to really iron out and just create a very stable low end. Now all of the low end on the quote-unquote real kick within the Kontakt instrument is very solid. I went out of my way to make sure that all the hits were very uniform from hit to hit when we were making the samples, so it's not a concern of mine. But just as a trick you could do in the real world when mixing real drums, or just a way of creating a new kick sound, is using, like I say, all the low end from the one-shot sample and then all the high end from the real kick. And let's hear how that sounds. So that's how that sounds. If I mute the one shot and put the EQ back, this is how the kick originally sounded. And I didn't have the phase button there. It sounds much better with that inverted. And again, you can use this technique with any of the different samples. So another one of my favorite samples in the library is the Tama kick resident head off. So I'm going to replace that, drag it in. Now I've got that one loaded. And the low end on this one's particularly fat, so we can use all the low end from that one. So as I said, you don't have to use the provided samples that come with Ultimate Heavy Drums. If you have your own collection of one-shot samples, you can quite easily load these into the Kontakt instrument and blend them in with the sounds in Kontakt, or just completely replace the kick with one of your own one-shot samples. So let's move on to the snare. I'm actually just going to bring the reverb down on the snare just for the time being. So for the snare, as I said, I've got the Gretsch bell brass lower tune snare. So I go to the snare one shots folder. So I'm obviously going to blend in a different snare to that one. So I might go with like the Mapex Wraith. I really like that snare sound. And that's the one shot sound. And I'm going to do what I did with the kick and just listen to them in solo and try and match the pitch just by listening to them. So these two snares are pretty much near enough in a similar pitch. They've both been pitched down the same amount. So if they were both at 0, they'd pretty much be at the same pitch by the sound of things. So they're either going to be in phase or out of phase. They should sit nicely with each other because they have a similar pitched ring to them. Cool. And you could do a similar thing, like get more of the high end from this quote-unquote real snare, and then hold the low end down with the one-shot sample. And I think I've got the transient turned up quite a bit there on the snare, so I can bring that down. It's not so bad in the mix, but obviously when you listen to a snare in isolation with the transient, the sustain up, you can hear that ring quite a lot. So another cool thing you can do, another kind of trick, is if you have like a really cranked high snare. So this one is quite high sounding. And we could load in the lowest snare sample in the one shot. So that would be the 402 low tuned. It sounds like this. It sounds very similar to the snare on like Kill Switches, Alive or Just Breathing. A lot of that kind of mid-2000s kind of metalcore mixes, big fat snare. So what you could do, this is a completely different trick. So you can either blend in this fat snare with the higher tune snare and try and get the phase to sit nicely between them. But a trick that you could do is actually use the reverb from the one shot and actually have the one shot sample fade it all the way down, so you're not actually hearing the sound of that, but you're hearing the reverb come from that. And this will add a bit more thickness and perceived weight to the snare in the mix, even though you're not hearing any of the one shot. So let me show you. So that was the reverb of the quote unquote real snare, the Kontakt snare. And bring in the reverb from the one shot sample here. Now this isn't a trick that I've used much myself, but it's just another cool thing that you can experiment with and creating different sounds. But it's always good to try and find a snare sound that you like the sound of and add in a snare one-shot sample that is providing something different to your original snare. So for example, the snare we have here is quite a high cranked sounding snare drum, so it would be cool to blend in a lower tune snare, providing you can get it in phase and get the phase to work nicely. And obviously there's this phase button on every single channel in the instrument, so you can try and finesse the phase. And another way of getting things in phase is obviously just mess around with the pitch, so you can control the pitch of the snare and the one-shot snare, and that can help you finesse your phase relationship between the snare coming from Kontakt and the one-shot snare. Cool, so I think this is a feature that a lot of people might glance over, and if they're new to this kind of stuff, may not understand how it works, but it's really easy just to load in any one-shot sample into the either kick or snare one-shot sample loader within the Kontakt instrument and just have a play around with the tilt EQ on the different channels, play around with the pitch or the reverb, and you can create even more possibilities by using this one-shot feature.